Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out, but I know you're all coming in from the air problem. Did you all read? It seems to be having an air inversion. So stay here. You can stay for this program, next week's program. You can just stay. I'm so glad to see you as we look back fourscore years. I've always wanted to say that here at Roosevelt House, and I get to say it. When 300,000 men and 7,000 ships launched the Normandy invasion, known by the code name Operation Neptune, and almost universally remembered since as D-Day. Had it failed, it might have been the low point of Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency. And 1944 surely would have been his last year in the White House. Instead, the operation succeeded, and the Nazis began the slow but inexorable retreat that would end on VE Day 11 months later after Roosevelt had died. This evening, we're here to remember the drama, the sacrifice, the individual heroics, and the triumph of that extraordinary operation. And we have the perfect guests to elaborate and inform and enlighten us. We're very pleased to welcome Garrett Graff, a veteran writer and former editor of Politico, whose previous books include studies of the FBI in the age of global terror, the Watergate scandal, the inside story of the government's search for alien life, and the very well-received prequel, if I may call it that, to the book we're here to explore, called The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11. And that's the format that Garrett has used and deployed to remember D-Day. So the oral history we're going to discuss this evening is the just released, as we're sitting here, When the Sea Came Alive, An Oral History of D-Day, which Publishers Weekly called gripping and propulsive. I have to say that exactly right? Congratulations to Garrett on this advance rave. And I think this is his first live with people event for the new book. And we're honored that you chose Roosevelt House, and we're happy that we asked you to be here for this anniversary event. By the way, Garrett also has a just posted New York Times essay, which I read this afternoon. I guess it'll make it to print. Does everything make it to print? It will. Well, it doesn't matter to the Times, so it shouldn't matter to us. It's called Why We Must Keep the Memory of D-Day Alive, which you're helping to do as well. And back to lead the conversation, making his fifth visit to Roosevelt House, I'm advised, is my good friend Craig Simons. Craig taught at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis and at the Naval War College in Newport, among other venues, here and overseas. And his many books on naval history include Operation Neptune, his own study of D-Day, which Garrett acknowledges as a source for his readings before he undertook his project. Craig's most recent book is a terrific biography of the Pacific Theater's most consequential Admiral Nimitz at war. And among his many awards, I always like to mention here that he won the Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt Award for one of his books, Decision at Sea. So just a bit of housekeeping. We're going to have a discussion of about 45 minutes between our two guests, followed by a Q&A, at which we'll invite your questions. For which I will ask everyone, even if you speak as loudly as Craig and Garrett do, and you will see they do, to please wait patiently for the microphones, because we have a group on Zoom tonight and we want them to participate fully in the conversation. Also, may I ask everyone to please check whatever electronic device you may have that you think is off. And I beg you to check it one more time to make sure it remains off. Now, after the discussion ends, provided your iPhone does not ring, I'm going to be looking, You're all invited for a reception and a book signing upstairs, at which you will be able and encouraged to purchase and get signed, both When the Sea Came Alive and Operation Neptune. Now, ordinarily now, I would ask our guests to their chairs, but before I bring Garrett and Craig on stage, I did want to add that this is not only the perfect time to host this conversation with the ideal experts, but also the perfect venue. Not because FDR still lived here in 1944. In fact, he had deeded it the previous year to Hunter College, and it was already a headquarters for the school's clubs and other organizations. It was even already a refuge for refugee young women who had enrolled at Hunter as soon as they arrived in the United States, some of whom, and we have these, our own oral histories, Garrett, oral histories of people who, young women who came to Roosevelt House simply to sit around and hear other young women speaking English so they could absorb English. They enrolled first and learned English here later. Not only was the New Deal created in FDR's library upstairs, but down the corridor in our north parlor on the second floor, the Fireside Chat was born as well. The first of 29 radio addresses that FDR delivered between 1932 and 1945, even though most chronologies do not acknowledge our Fireside Chat as the first, because they only count the ones that he gave in the White House. But he did do a Fireside Chat the day after Election Day, 1932, because, I know you won't believe this, but the Republican candidate did not concede. He won 9 states, but he didn't concede because he didn't want to, so Roosevelt gave a Fireside Chat. So here is where FDR discovered and harnessed the full impact of radio, of course, based on his own absolute mastery of this relatively new national medium. I'm not going to play that first chat, but we are going to play, and it is available on YouTube, both as an audio and as a version he gave for Fox Movietone News right after finishing the Fireside Chat. But I do want to play, I think it's appropriate, a bit of the chat he offered on D-Day, for which he wrote his own text in the form of a long and heartfelt prayer for the safety and success of the troops. So let's listen to part of it, FDR on June 6, 1944.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, last night, when I spoke with you about the fall of Rome, I knew at that moment that troops of the United States and our allies were crossing the Channel in another and greater operation. It has come to pass with success thus far. And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. For the enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph.
Just let me acknowledge and thank our own Danny Culkin for putting that together so beautifully. Good job, Danny. And with that, remembering the uncertainty that only later turned to relief and ultimately celebration, let me now ask you to join me in welcoming Garrett Graff in conversation with Craig Simons.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. A full house. We're greatly honored. I'm sure it's for Garrett rather than for me, but I appreciate it nonetheless. I'm going to start tonight by stealing from another writer. Ron Charles is the head book review editor in the Washington Post, and this past Sunday, just as the New York Times has a Sunday fold-out section on book reviews, so does the Washington Post, and Ron Charles is their lead reviewer. And I read this review just this last weekend. I'm going to read just the first sentence and then the penultimate paragraph. Would that I would get a review like this. Never before have I approached the anniversary of D-Day in such a state of sober awe. The hellish day itself explodes across the beaches and through the air. Soldiers describe the clash of strategy and chaos, heroism and panic, victory and carnage. Every voice here is part of a chorus that heralded the moment when the world teetered between freedom and tyranny. Wow. Congratulations for that. What Garrett has done, for those of you who don't know and have not read his previous book that was also an oral history of sorts, is all but invent a new art form by putting together a series of snippets, and that sounds diminutive to express it that way, but passages from those who participated and string them together in a way that tells you a narrative as if you were there with them, listening to them, and it's absolutely gripping. I'm going to ask him later at the end of this discussion about the audio version of this, but this is the written version, and it is absolutely unputdownable, as they say. One of the things that he mentions early on, Garrett, is that you were inspired to begin thinking about D-Day by a cartoon that you saw when you were 11 years old. Can you tell us what that was?
Yeah. Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Harold, for hosting me tonight. It's a real honor to be here on this stage with two historians that I greatly admire. Craig's book, Operation Neptune, I was telling him upstairs, is one of the 6 or so books that were really critical to me in as reference sources in my own writing, compiling this. So thank you for your hard work on this same story. So I'm effectively a lifelong history buff. And I have a very distinct memory of when D-Day sort of first caught my attention. I was a few weeks short of my 11th birthday in 1993. And Charles, I was sitting in my parents' house in Burlington, in Montpelier, Vermont, and it was a year before the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and Charles Schulz wrote or illustrated the most stark and surprising installment of his Peanuts cartoon that he ever did. And on that Sunday of the 49th anniversary, he had a 3-pane comic that ran, it was about the top third or quarter of the page of the Burlington Free Press comic section that day. The first was a drawing of a German bunker on the Normandy coast. The second was actually a drawing of the same picture that you saw up here that was taken by a Coast Guard photographer on the run in to Omaha Beach. First Lieutenant Gardner Botsford is the figure on the right-hand side in profile. He goes on to become a very famous New Yorker writer, and is a young Army intelligence officer that morning. And then the third frame of this Snoopy cartoon is Snoopy dressed as a GI, huddled in the surf behind a German beach obstacle. And the entire text just says, June 6th, 1944, to remember. And it was a cartoon that I just caught my attention right away for all of the obvious reasons. And I tore it out of the newspaper, and it hung on my bedroom wall as a teen for the rest of my life, and is actually still framed in my office in Burlington, Vermont now. I sort of talk about it in the book, an experience that probably both of you gentlemen have been through as well, which is, as a writer, you never know when a book really begins, because sort of by the time you actually sit down to start writing a book, you have made the intellectual and emotional commitment to that book sort of long before an ink is dry on a publishing contract. And I think in many ways, I started writing this book that day in 1993.
Great story, thank you. Who is Woody Woodbridge?
Woody was the guy who showed me around Normandy last year. He's a British historian who has spent about the last 30 years, I don't know if you've ever crossed paths with him, living in Normandy and sort of showing, leading tours and leading historical projects around Normandy. And I got the chance to spend a week with him exploring Normandy last year as part of the book research. And it was I'm a very firm believer, as a journalist, as a researcher, like, you always have to go somewhere. You never really understand a place until you're there and you're able to sort of experience it and feel it. And I had spent, by the time I got to Normandy, I'd spent months working at sort of the high level of D-Day, looking at the planning, the Roosevelts, the Churchills, the Eisenhowers, the Montgomerys. And what Woody did for me during the week that we were there was really take me through what that battle looked like as an individual soldier. That, that we would go to these sites and, he would walk through, this is what Joe Dawson saw when he was staring up this draw off the beach. That's where the German machine gun was. That's where the German machine gun was. This is the chateau wall where General Wilhelm Fally's car crashed after being ambushed by paratroopers early on the morning of June 6th. This is what it was like we walked Omaha Beach at half tide, from the tide up. And until you do that, like, you have just no sense of just how far those dunes were from safety when these troops were landing that morning. And for me, it was such a valuable educational moment to really look at this battle, not in the way that I think we tend to write about it as historians, but to see it as 167,000 individual stories. And that, to me, was a big part of why I wanted to do this book as an oral history. That, this 80th anniversary this week is, I think, in many ways so poignant because it also marks the passing of the greatest generation, the generation that won World War II. on D-Day, there were 1 million Allied personnel in motion across England, across the English Channel. There are a couple thousand of those left. England currently estimates there are only 6 living D-Day veterans in Great Britain left. And that, from a historian standpoint, in a weird way, what this means is we have at this moment effectively every first-person memory of D-Day we will ever have. And so my hope with this book was to try to step back and tell the story of D-Day in the first person through the voices of the people who participated in it at a moment when this event, probably the biggest event in human history. I mean, one of the few true turning points for the entire world, slips from living memory permanently into history. And that was sort of my hope in the draw of doing this book at this
I wanted
moment.
to ask you about Woody because your acknowledgement to him was so heartfelt that I viscerally felt what an impact that week of examining the places where it happened had on the way the book emerged at the end.
Yeah. You have probably done these equivalents of what the military calls staff rides at battlefields, and it really is amazing when you get out there to these battle sites and realize how much of it is geography and how much of it is terrain. Right. And there's a chapter in the back of the book, actually sort of the last chapter of D-Day itself, the Battle of Lafayette Causeway, which is this battle fought by paratroopers, U.S. paratroopers it is the westernmost battle of D-Day. And it's over this tiny stone bridge. I mean, the whole stone bridge can't be sort of much wider than this room. And it is S.L.A. Marshall, who's this sort of famous Army historian, was present in Normandy during the Normandy campaign. He says that Lafayette Causeway was not only the fiercest battle in the European theater, period, it was the fiercest encounter, small unit encounter in the history of American arms. And, you're standing there at this bridge, and I mean, it's the width of this room. And it is, I tell sort of one snippet of the battle that takes place on D-Day. The battle itself at Lafayette Causeway lasts for a couple of days. There are 2 medals of honor won on that bridge and something like 16 Distinguished Service Crosses. Most of the battle that one day on D-Day is basically there's like 4 bazooka men paratroopers up against an entire German tank assault and infantry assault that they managed to turn back. And it's basically the 4 of them. A couple of supporting units further back, but it's the 4 of them on this bridge. And Marcus Heim says, it's the final quote of the chapter, I have no idea why we survived. And there's no way that these 4 guys should have survived this fight and held off the German counterattack that day. And they did. And it becomes, it is one of the 1,500 minor turning points that day, sort of largely lost to history, that changed the entire arc of D-Day.
And you would drive by it in your car today and not even notice it. It is so small, so undistinguished. There's no rails on the sides because it spans what is essentially a meadow today. But the Germans had flooded that meadow, narrowing the approach road to this one Thermopylae-like span, as Garrett says, no wider than this room. But should they seize that, it would collapse the right flank of the whole Utah Beach invasion. So sometimes these moments come down to these small, platoon-sized engagements, one to another. I wanted to ask you, earlier in your book, you mentioned that there are a number of myths that are associated with D-Day that somehow just emerged and people continue to repeat them to one another. I wonder if you would be willing to share what a couple of those are and why you felt compelled to debunk them.
Yeah. This is going to be one of those embarrassing author tests because I know I say in the book that there are 4 of them. I don't think I'm going to be able to come up with all 4 of them off the top of my head tonight. But one of them that I think is worth tackling is this idea that D-Day was a tenuous, close-run event. That D-Day could have failed. And you might actually argue against this as the world scholar of the Neptune sea lift. But the truth of the matter is that in World War II, every Allied amphibious invasion succeeds. And they all succeed precisely because they are so high risk that the Allies and the U.S. particularly so over-delivers in the material and personnel and manpower and firepower at these events that the landings are always going to succeed. That by the time you get to D-Day, leaving the weather aside, which is a factor we can talk about, that the Allies had so overinvested in the personnel, in the secret operations, in the breadth and depth and scope of the bombing campaign and the sea lift capability, that the Allies were always going to get ashore on D-Day. The question was always, I think, what was going to happen in the next 72 to 96 hours? Could the Germans bring up their reinforcements fast enough? Could the Allies get their supplies, keep the supply lines open to get reinforcements ashore? And to me, what is, I think, so fascinating, and I talk a little bit about this in the book as well, I think D-Day stands as one of the most interesting examples and case studies in leadership that we have in history. Leadership at the top and leadership at the bottom. And that the first third of this book is really all about the big names. It is Roosevelt and Churchill and Ike and Montgomery and the planners and, this story of the Allies and the British learning to cooperate and work together as allies, which I think is this fascinating story in and of itself. And then at H hour, 6:30 a.m. on Tuesday, June 6th, there is nothing any of those big names can do to influence the outcome of D-Day any longer. And that the story of D-Day's success itself is the leadership and the training that kicks in with these corporals and sergeants and lieutenants who bring this new style of warfare to the Germans that is sort of imaginative and innovative and entrepreneurial, where they sort of are able to make decisions on the fly and adjust their orders because they sort of think that they see an opportunity that, wasn't anticipated. And that the whole day really turns on these little decisions and these little examples of leadership among small groups of men, made at sea, made in the landing craft, made on shore, made in the air. And that what you see that coming up against is the German model of leadership, which is, this top-down, hierarchical, sort of Hitler-centric, confused chain of command, where you have a whole system that really doesn't encourage a lot of innovative, out-of-the-box thinking. Like, there is not a lot to be said for the job prospects of a particularly innovative German leader, short of Hitler. And so the Germans sort of spend all day in this paralysis, waiting for orders from Hitler, waiting to commit to their reinforcements. And, but for, the fact that Hitler sort of sleeps really late on D-Day, and no one is willing to wake him up. The Germans aren't able to actually launch their sole counterattack of D-Day until about 4 p.m. on the afternoon of June 6th, by which point it is far too late for the Germans to dislodge the forces at the beach.
Hitler missed the bus, as
Yes.
Chamberlain famously said. It's interesting you make this distinction between those at the very top, whose names we all know, Churchill, obviously, Franklin Roosevelt, in whose home we now reside, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Ramsey. Which of these people rose in your estimation as you worked on this project, and which did not?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you my sort of favorite character of the big leaders is the chief of the UK Imperial Staff, sort of their equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Lord Alan Brooke, who keeps this incredibly bitter diary through all of World War II. That is not published until, you might know the exact date, but in the last 20 years or 30 years or so. It took decades for it to come out. And basically, he goes home every day and writes down all of his complaints about all of his fellow commanders every single day. And so I sort of include these like snippets of the diary of him coming home and, going like, spent the day with Eisenhower. I don't see what anyone sees in this guy. He's got no strategic capability whatsoever. He's very nice, but is not a soldier at all. And then, his thoughts on Montgomery and Churchill and sort of all of these other people. And it is sort of one of those like classic examples of someone who just believes that they are completely surrounded by fools.
Well, Alan Brooke, whose name was Alan Brooke, but when he went to the peerage, became Lord Alan Brooke as a single name. So if you look him up in an index, try both Alan Brooke and Brooke, Alan. But one of the reasons he was so disappointed was because Churchill had promised him, you will lead the invasion of Europe. I pledged you. And then, of course, Churchill, a politician that he is, realizes the Americans were putting more into the kitty than the British, and it's going to have to be an American. And he says, Alan, well, too bad that it's not going to be you after all. So he had a lot to be disappointed about. But you're right, those diary entries are absolutely sparkling. He didn't like anybody.
Yeah. Which is not precisely true, because he knew exactly where his bread was buttered, because he has very favorable things to say about the king every time the king appears.
That's true. That's a good point. What does it mean? Now, some of these, don't gasp now, some of these senior officers were bigoted. What did it mean for an officer to be bigoted?
Yeah. So bigot is the very unfortunate acronym or code name for the officers who were read into the only two details of D-Day that actually matter, which are where the landings are going to take place and when. And that sort of the entire Allied secrecy apparatus in the spring of 1944 is built around preserving these two specific pieces of secrecy. And the phrase bigot, it comes from this sort of very weird nomenclature where officers and soldiers who were years earlier on their way secretly to North Africa had their orders stamped to Gib, Togib, to Gibraltar, which was the cover for where their travel orders were supposed to take them. And then they reversed, for some reason that I was never able to actually uncover sort of why this happened. They just reversed it, and rather than to Gib, you get bigot. And what's amazing is this is still actually a phrase that the government uses today. For classified operations today, there remains what is officially known as a bigot list, which is the list of people who are read into these specific classified programs. And there's this great scene in the book where the king goes aboard one of the ships and it is trying to get into one of the map rooms on the ship where they have the invasion maps up, and the midshipmen won't let the king in. And, he says, sorry, Your Majesty, very secret stuff. And then, promptly gets yelled at by, one of the admirals, why didn't you let the king in? And the midshipman shout, sort of startles and say, well, I'm sorry, sir, no one told me the king was a bigot.
And speaking of bigots, would you spend a little bit of time talking about the experience Black American GIs had in England prior to the invasion?
Yeah. I think that this was, to me, one of the great advantages of trying to do a history like this so many decades after, is that we've had the opportunity to have a lot of stories that were less familiar come out in the history since. And, the story of D-Day is overwhelmingly white and male. But it is not as exclusively white and male as history has normally told that subject.
There's another myth.
Yes. And I spend some time in the book talking about the racial tensions that come from the Black soldiers being deployed in a segregated Jim Crow military to England, and a country that has no history or culture of racial discrimination. And these Black soldiers are welcomed by the British with fully open arms. And not only fully open arms, but the British women are particularly interested in the sort of music and culture of these Black soldiers, much to the sort of chagrin and anger of the white Southern soldiers who are not used to a society where the sort of strict protocols of Jim Crow are not being enforced. And I title this particular chapter "The American Invasion," because before you get to the Allied invasion of Europe, there's another very important invasion, which is the American invasion of Great Britain, where we move 1.4 million personnel, literal armies, across an ocean to Great Britain. There are 5,000 American soldiers who land per day in England from the summer of 1943 through the spring of 1944. By the time D-Day actually happens, 10% of the adult male population of Great Britain is American male soldiers. And these Black soldiers, there are 130,000 Black soldiers deployed to England among this force, to a country that only has 8,000 Black residents in a country of 47 million. So it's a real culture shock. And the British government wants nothing to do with Jim Crow. And they put out these statements where they say basically, like, we're not going to let America export their racial problem to us. None of you police, none of you local constabulary enforce any racial divisions. But the military ends up having to, in order to diffuse the racial tension, enforce these racial divisions where there will be sort of black knights in the pubs and white knights in the pubs in England so that the units don't mix. And then I'll take one more minute to tell one other story related to this real quickly. There is on D-Day one black combat unit that lands in Normandy. And there are about 2,000 black soldiers who land on D-Day. Most of them are stevedores and quartermasters, and then this one black combat unit that runs barrage balloons. And the medic for that unit is this guy, Staff Sergeant Waverly Woodson Jr., who is wounded before he even gets to shore, then spends 30 hours on Omaha Beach treating U.S. casualties before being evacuated himself, while wounded, while trying to treat his own wounds. He treats on the order of 200 U.S. casualties, which is, depending on how exactly you count it, somewhere between 5 and 7% of all U.S. casualties on Omaha Beach he's involved in treating personally. He's considered at the time for the Medal of Honor, but in the racism of that era, not a single black soldier in World War II is awarded the Medal of Honor. None of the 432 Medals of Honor of World War II go to black soldiers. And the Clinton administration sort of tries to right this in the 1990s and creates a commission to sort of revisit the recognition of heroism of black soldiers. And even though they find that Waverly Woodson is one of just 4 black soldiers who was considered for the Medal of Honor during the war, they don't give Waverly Woodson a Medal of Honor because the Pentagon has lost his paperwork by the 1990s. And this fight has continued for 80 years. And yesterday, the Pentagon announced that Waverly Woodson is receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest combat valor award. And his widow is 95 years old. She turned 95 2 Sundays ago, about 10 days ago. And and this is sort of the wonderful thing that the military will do. They have taken a World War II era Distinguished Service Cross to Omaha Beach this week, where the First Army historian has geolocated where Waverly Woodson came ashore, and they are going to hold a ceremony there on Thursday, and then bring the medal back to deliver it to his widow later in June.
I'm glad I asked that question. I'll tell just 2 more additions to that, if it's okay. One of the things that characterized this racial problem in the United States Army in World War II is that the blood of white people and black people could not be mixed. White people would prefer to bleed out than to accept blood been donated by a black soldier. But the story I want to end this particular chapter with is one that was told to me when I was teaching at the British Naval Academy back in 1994, coming up to the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landing. And there were still people alive then in South Devon who remembered those occasions. And this was not told to me, but it appeared in the local paper that someone asked a local farmer. He said, well, what did you think of the Americans coming in and moving you out of your home and sort of taking over your property? What did you think of the Americans? And he said, well, actually, they were right fine blokes, but I didn't like many of the white buggers they brought with them. What was Operation Fortitude, Garrett?
So Operation Fortitude was one of sort of several different operations that the Allies put together to create a sort of deception around both where the Allies would invade, when they would invade, how they would invade. And it's a sort of fascinating mix of programs where the Allies end up creating entire fake armies. They put General Patton, a pretty well-respected combat leader, in charge of a literally invented army that complete with inflatable tanks, inflatable planes, inflatable landing craft, and build these giant tent cities that would house, in theory, thousands of troops, but in fact were staffed only with skeleton crews who would go around and sort of keep the campfires burning, literally, for German reconnaissance planes. And they had special radio units, American radio units, who would go drive around the countryside, mimicking what a sort of division and Army Corps radio traffic would look like, so that the Germans could intercept it. And the goal was both to keep Germany from focusing its resources in any one place. So part of this operation was geared towards convincing the Germans that the first Allied invasion would actually take place against Norway. And then that the invasion, if and when it took place in France, would be targeted against the Pas-de-Calais region, which was on the map sort of the part of France closest to England. And these operations, were incredibly extensive, incredibly well-resourced, and so sort of detailed and thought out that even on D-Day, the Germans are not convinced that this is the real invasion, and that they think that the real invasion is still coming against Pas-de-Calais or Norway, such that on D-Day, when the Allies confirm that the landing is underway, the first statement that they release is from the exiled Norwegian king, meant to sort of indicate that the landing in Norway is conceivably quite imminent, on the heels of this, tiny little landing feint in Normandy that is taking place that day.
Some of you, I suspect, may subscribe to or have an opportunity to read the New York Review of Books. The one that just came out this week has a wonderful review of 9 books, 8 of them written in French by Frenchmen, about the impact of D-Day on French civilians living in the Normandy area. And I start with that to back into this question, which is there was a lot of controversy among the decision makers on the Allied side about the bombing campaign. How long should it be? What should be targeted? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's not unrelated to the question of the deception operations, right? Because one of the things that the Allies did was they wanted to make sure that the Germans weren't able to detect any discernible pattern in the targets being bombed by Allied air forces. And so they actually dropped 2 bombs outside of Normandy for every 1 bomb dropped against targets in Normandy, which you can imagine sort of the immense, effectively collateral damage of that one portion of this alone. But then there's this big debate in the ranks of the Supreme Allied Command about sort of how to target the bombers as the Normandy campaign approaches. And there's sort of one argument to target the oil infrastructure and to, basically focus on, busting the industrial supply chains of Germany, let the German military run out of gas. And then the other is basically, let's just bomb the heck out of France. and let's destroy their transportation system, their let's keep everything from being able to be moved, because again, that fear of those first 72, 96 hours is the reinforcements that could be brought up. And so what they end up doing is they target all of the rail infrastructure and transportation infrastructure across northern France that come with a lot of civilian casualties, because that's mostly civilian infrastructure that they're targeting. And there's a real concern in the Allied High Command that basically that we will have turned the French population against us by the time we actually get there to liberate them, because they were estimating, I forget what the exact number is, but like 50,000 French civilian casualties in the bombing campaign leading up to D-Day. It ends up being a much lower number because of weather factors and the fact that the railways were not heavily protected by anti-aircraft guns, sort of, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the really remarkable aspects of it is how devastating the Allied campaign was, both before and after the invasion itself, and yet how grateful the French remain to the Allies for liberation.
Right. I'm going to ask one last question. So begin thinking about questions you might want to ask Garrett, because after this, I'm going to turn to you for some queries, and we'll continue the conversation. I want to ask you, who's Bill Millen?
So Bill Millen is the bagpiper for the British Commandos. And the British Commandos, there are units of the British Commandos who land at all three British Canadian beaches, Juno, Gold, and Sword. But Millen is with the Lord Lovett's brigade of the Commandos, whose job it is to race inland and link up with the paratroopers who had been dropped overnight to secure the bridges along the eastern flank. And some of you may know this story. The way that the sort of assault unfolds is you have the 5 beaches, and the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne for the American paratroopers are dropped along the western edge to secure that flank overnight, and the British 6th Airborne is dropped along the eastern flank in this, particularly in this one very, very daring raid against what's now known as Pegasus Bridge, where there are these 3 gliders of British paratroopers who land in this impossibly small area next to the bridge and charge out of the gliders and seize the bridge before the German defenders are able to even realize what's happening. But that's pretty far inland, and the Germans are beginning to counterattack, and if the British commandos are not able to link up with them that day, they will probably all be killed or captured. And so Lord Lovett races across the beach with his unit and gets Bill Millen piping as quickly as he can, so that the paratroopers can hear the bagpipes and know that help is on the way.
Yeah, tremendous scene. Okay, questions from you, and please, would you wait until a microphone comes? There's one right down here, and you're next. So you'll be first in the orange shirt, and here comes the microphone.
My question is several, but do them quickly. For many of us, what we have any knowledge of the actual landings comes from movies. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if at some point you may comment on whether it's The Longest Day or Searching for Private Ryan or anything else that would give some sense of the chaos and the death that was all around. The other thing is that you mentioned the business of amphibious invasions, and I'm wondering, in the context of always succeeding, how Dieppe fit in with all that.
Waiting for somebody to
And,
mention
and,
Dieppe.
and the other one was also about a bridge that was a killing field, and I was thinking of Antietam. And I'm surprised that that was not the equivalent in terms of the death or whatever went on in terms of destruction.
Okay, on the movies, you want to go first?
Yeah. Saving Private Ryan is Omaha Beach in the first wave. And it is probably about as accurate a movie depiction as we will ever see of a moment like D-Day. So that first wave at Omaha Beach is sort of exactly as bad as history holds it up to be. The Company A of the 116th Infantry, 29th Division, it's a federalized National Guard unit mostly from Bedford, Virginia, and the small towns around Bedford, Virginia. Land in the first wave at the western edge of Omaha Beach, what's known as the Veerville Draw. And there are 230 members of the company that leave the troop ship Empire Javelin that morning. 18 make it to the end of the day unscathed. Company B is the second to land there, sort of still part of the first wave, comes in right behind Company A. Same size company to start, roughly 28 make it to the end of the day unscathed. And I mean, that first wave at Omaha, part of what is so striking about that moment is half of the soldiers in that first wave land at sort of the equivalent places. There's Company E comes ashore at the Colville Draw in front of 2 German resistance nests. That's actually the photo that was up here earlier that's known as the Taxi to Hell photo of them getting off, and that's Company E heading to shore. They face sort of the same level of massacre. And then there are landing craft that sort of happen to hit in between German resistance nests, and for them it's as easy a day as any training exercise, and it just is totally dependent that morning on that beach where you actually land. And when we talk about sort of the 4 myths, part of what one of the myths that I try to take on is this idea that Omaha Beach was, nearly a disaster. And that is sort of technically true for, specific companies and specific places along Omaha Beach. But what is incredible about how the soldiers perform on Omaha Beach is even amid that level of carnage and these sort of completely shattered companies, there are enough men who seize the initiative that the first American units are actually up on the cliffs of Omaha Beach by about 9 a.m. that morning, which is sort of one of the things that we sort of lose sight of in our historical telling of Omaha Beach as this colossal disaster. It was incredibly deadly. I mean, it was carnage, equivalent to any of the worst fighting Americans have had in any, in any Antietam or Tarawa or Iwo Jima. But Omaha Beach was a success pretty quickly that morning.
I agree. I think the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan are about as visceral a sense of what that morning was like as you could possibly put on celluloid. I'll tell one quick story about it. Steve Ambrose, some of you know Stephen Ambrose's name. They tried out an early version of that, showing it to him, and he told me subsequently that after the first 15 minutes, he had to have them stop the film because he couldn't see it anymore through his tears. So it's very effective and very moving, and I'm a big fan. As for Dieppe, very quickly, Churchill characterized this as a raid. The Canadians had been in Britain for a year. They wanted something to do. This seemed an opportunity to try out some of the new technologies of amphibious craft. The idea was to seize some German radars to see how far they'd gone in that technology. But the argument is it was never supposed to be an invasion. It was only a raid. A little bit of that is cover. Mountbatten is responsible, I think, for pushing that too soon in the wrong place. But you, I think, can still argue that any invasion intended to be an invasion usually managed to get their feet on the sand and stay there, even if it was like Anzio and they were trapped there. But getting them there the first day, that's hard, but nearly as hard is keeping them there. Yeah. Okay, and there's a question in the back here.
There was a wonderful book that came out in about 2000, A War to Be Won. And a point they made in that book is that the Marine Corps was not consulted by the U.S. Army at all about how to conduct an amphibious operation. The Army just decided we're not talking to the Marines. And my question would be, first, given that the Navy's involved and the Navy runs the Marines, it's amazing to me. But
Don't tell the Marines that the Navy runs the Marines, by the way.
But the other question, but the real thing is, how many Americans do you think died because of that refusal, and how much harder was the invasion made?
I'll take that first. It's not entirely true that the Army said, we don't want to talk to the Marines, we don't care what you have to say. Several senior officers, mostly Navy, by the way, including Admiral Kirk, went out to the Pacific to observe operations run by the Marines. And a lot of that information was shared back and forth, but it is true that I think there was a certain sense of not propriety, what am I trying to say?
Proprietariness.
Proprietary
Yeah.
attitudes between the two services, that the Marines' view was the Pacific is ours and the Atlantic is yours. That's not true either, as John McManus has shown us in his 3-volume series on the Army in the Pacific, which actually had more divisions engaged in combat in the Pacific than the Marines did. But you're right, there was a tension. The Marines had a particular way of doing things. Their notion was move fast, quickly, seize it, take heavy casualties early on, and then move on and let the Army come in and put up the PX. So there's a little bit of Semper Fi attitude mixed into that. And yes, it could have been better if the services had cooperated more than they did, but I'm not going to try to come up with a number of lives that might have been saved. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, I would add 2 pieces of texture to that answer. One is there were 700 Marines at D-Day. The part of what is so fascinating about D-Day is it was as international and giant an operation as you can possibly imagine. I mean, there were 600 Dutch sailors as part of the D-Day invasion fleet that day. So, you know, there were plenty of Marines piloting landing craft into the beaches that day. The other thing, though, when you get into the planning for D-Day is very largely and heavily British. It's not even a question of American sort of intra-service rivalry. The planning staff for Operation Overlord for most of the first year is almost entirely British, you know, run by British leaders, and because the Americans are still sort of creating their military in this moment. I mean, a big part of the first chunk of this book ends up being, you know, we have this sort of easy story that we tell ourselves of, you know, Britain and America are great allies and special relationship and, you know, longest standing partners. We spent a lot of those first couple of years of the war learning how to be allies, learning how to cooperate, learning how to join our, you know, Roosevelt and Churchill working together, you know, Montgomery and Eisenhower working together, Lord Allenbrook, you know, not working with anyone. You know, I think that's a part of the story that we skip over a lot now. But you know, there's you know, Roosevelt got there But he had a lot of, domestic politics to overcome before he could, throw America into this war in the way that America needed to in order to win it.
Right here, and then,
Over.
yeah, then you, and then you. And then I think we're done.
Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. You both probably know the 2020 Saturday Evening Post article about Eisenhower being asked what was the most difficult decision he had to make, and his response being it wasn't go on the 6th, it was send the paratroopers in the night before, because the British Air Marshal, who was the senior decision maker on that, said call it off. Casualties would be too high. But in they went anyway. And it's been heavily romanticized. And the question is, given the resources that hit the beach and given the bombing that went on there, if the paratroopers hadn't gone in, do you still think the outcome would have been similar?
You want to go?
I think that this is an incident that is accurate but overblown, I think, in a lot of the history, because Eisenhower, I don't think, ever really wavered on the paratroopers. And when the British Chief Air Marshal comes to him and sort of complains yet again about wanting to cancel the paratroop operation, Eisenhower, I think, sees it less as a legitimate concern and more of a, are you really going to leave me here holding the bag for this and go around and tell everyone that you advocated against this, at the last minute? The paratroopers are enormously important to the success of D-Day on the western flank and the eastern flank. And I actually think one of the things that gets overlooked is how resource constrained the Allies were, even with all of the resources of D-Day. One of the reasons that Omaha Beach is such a violent killing ground for the American troops is there are no paratroopers dropped behind Omaha Beach. That's not for a lack of paratroopers. There's a whole Polish paratroop brigade that is not used on D-Day because we don't have the airlift capacity to get them there. And had those, I think the more interesting question to me is sort of less, what if the paratroopers hadn't gone? It's more, had we had the planes to drop the Polish, I think it was the 7th Parachute Brigade, in behind Omaha Beach, how different the fight on Omaha Beach would have been on the morning of June 6th.
Yeah, I'll just, okay, this is going to be, I guess, the last question down here, I'm told.
Yes, I'm Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. I have a straightforward question and somewhat embarrassing for the Roosevelt House. Since the armed forces, U.S. armed forces, were not desegregated until Truman, does that make Roosevelt a racist?
I won't pretend to understand. I won't pretend to know enough about Roosevelt's policies to answer a question like that.
I will simply say this in defense of Roosevelt, and that is to say Franklin Roosevelt had to be the President of the United States during two of the greatest crises of our national history. One, of course, is the Great Depression. The other is the Second World War. And he had to do so by keeping the people and Congress and the Senate all pulling in the same direction on the same rope. Should he have done more to integrate the services? Should he have done more to make sure the Black American soldiers got their due, not only at the time, but afterward? In a perfect world, absolutely. But every time he made a step in that direction, he lost ground in getting support from boll weevil senators from the South who wouldn't support the Lend-Lease bill or the mobilization bill or some other thing necessary to achieve the broader goals that he wanted. So it's easy to look back and judge and say, well, Abraham Lincoln dallied before he declared slavery, a bad thing. Well, yes, but he had to bring the country with him to do it. And Franklin Roosevelt had to do much the same thing. The criticism is fair. I'm not saying it's not fair, but put it needs to be put in the historical context of the moment in which Roosevelt made those decisions. Do you want to add any more to that?
Well, sort of along those lines, I mean, when I was talking about, you know, how much isolationism Roosevelt had to overcome to get us into the war in the first place, to me, one of the really poignant parts of the book is the chapter on Pearl Harbor, actually, and when America enters the war. And Churchill talks about how he slept so well on the night of December 7th, 1941, because he knew that England was saved. That he had felt up until that moment that he was fighting, that the English people were fighting alone against Nazi Germany. And that he says, you know, I did not know how long it would take. I did not understand how hard it was going to be. But I knew that Hitler's fate was sealed, Mussolini's fate was sealed, that Japan would be ground to dust. That's his exact words. And that night I went to sleep and slept the sleep of the saved and the peaceful, or something like that.
I think that does it for us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roosevelt House. And there is a reception upstairs.